nothing very highfalutin or exciting, no trapeze artists, nothing going on with computers. Think instead about the lives of women on welfare. I studied welfare for quite a long time, and I can speak about the way welfare operated in the past and the way it operates today. And for poor women and their children, surveillance and witch hunts and terror don't have anything to do with secret networks. They don't have anything to do with complex computer programs. They really have to do with women, men who work at the welfare office interrogating you about what you have in your cupboard, or where you got that watch, or whether you had your period last month. Or they have to do with a knock on the door in the middle of the night to see if there's a guy who you haven't acknowledged in the little house or the apartment. And that really is surveillance. That's the way it's always been for poor people who turn to government for help. They've been under surveillance, they've been exposed to punishment, and since the punishment is they won't get any help with their bills, their rent, they have kids, that punishment is really terrifying. So there's surveillance and terror. It's very ordinary. You don't need anything fancy to do it. We've always done it to poor women, but also poor guys, and we've done it for hundreds of years. Or think about the people who are looking for a job. They don't have any special skills or qualification, so it's just going to be a low-wage job. And the employer is going to ask them all sorts of questions, and the employer might also ask them for a urine sample to prove that they haven't taken any drugs, and that also is surveillance. And the punishment for not getting through the mesh of the surveillance system is what? Not getting the job. And if you're unemployed and that's your only option, that also is terror. And now, of course, especially for young men of color, there is stop and frisk. And that's kind of ordinary too, because it happens every day, all the time, on the street. You're just coming home from school or from seeing your buddies. Not much to it. The mayor sort of dismisses it, waves it aside. But that's surveillance, terror, and it may entail severe punishment. Now, all these kinds of surveillance are not political in the usual sense. They don't have to do with trying to penetrate the plots of insurgents or rebels or revolutionaries or anything like that. They don't have to do with the dealings of powerful states with each other. No, they have to do just with keeping people down. The point of this kind of surveillance of poor people and the punishments that can be inflicted as a result of what's found or not found in the surveillance, the point of that is to keep people subordinate. The point is to degrade them. I mean, what do we accomplish when we expose women on welfare to midnight raids or other kinds of intrusive personal scrutiny? We don't accomplish anything for the larger society. What we do accomplish is ridiculing this woman, making her into a pariah, and making her in her own head and in her own heart feel really degraded. Now, but there also is, and I think this is what most of the day's panels have been about, there also is the kind of surveillance, the witch hunts, the infiltration that we associate with politics in the somewhat narrower sense. The politics of states, of ruling classes, the politics that leads to the surveillance and suppression of insurgents and or dissenters or protesters or revolutionaries. Now, we've always had that kind of surveillance, or maybe not always, but for as long as you care to remember or know about. The emergence of city-states and nation-states in the Western world was also associated with the development of the capacity to watch what the citizenry does, to listen closely, to interfere with what they do, and then to punish selectively. So, think about 17th and 18th century Britain, a period during these centuries, more predatory capitalist class was emerging at the beginning in agriculture. That's where they made their fortunes, and that's where they established the early mills. And that was also where they expressed their drive for acquisition by enclosing the common lands that people had eked out a kind of living with, or by rolling back traditional poor relief, and ultimately by forcing people, with children first, then women, then the handloom weavers, forcing them into factories where their work behavior could be watched and disciplined. So there was that sort of everyday domestic kind of surveillance involved in the development of British capitalism. But there was also the political surveillance conducted by the Home Office. And so thorough and so extensive was the Home Office's penetration of insurgency in the British towns and countryside that the British historians who in the closing years of the 20th century started to study social protest among poor and working people, they relied on the records of the Home Office. There were no academic archives on protest in the countryside, but the Home Office had done a fine job. Similarly, in the United States, as industrialization, capitalist industrialization, grew in the 19th century, so did the capacity both of government, but also in the United States of corporations to conduct surveillance of workers, to watch what they did, to listen closely, to penetrate their secret societies. Everybody has secret societies. First thing kids do in their adolescence, they have a secret society. But the big corporations of the United States that emerged in the late 19th century were known for the extensive use of spies and goons, watching, listening on the factory floor, and also trying to change the course of worker self-organization and worker self-defense by acting as plants, acting as, what's the word for that? Things, I guess. And then, also in the 19th century, the Pinkertons Everybody has heard, I suppose, of the Pinkertons. They were the private police force that was deployed extensively by American corporations to police workers, essentially. But the Pinkertons, this business flourished so that there were more people employed by the Pinkertons in the late 19th century than there were in the United States Armed Forces. And then, of course, there's the special case of the New York Police Department. I would really love to read an exhaustive, thorough history of the New York cops, because this stuff that we're all so upset about today, you know, not only stop and frisk, but the way in which they curb demonstrations, kettle demonstrations, and also their Secret Service activities. You know, they think that they're a government unto themselves. They have their own intelligence agencies. They have agents all over the world. That goes way back. It wasn't always as big or as bad as it is today, but it certainly goes back to the very beginning of the 20th century, when the police were charged with curbing anarchism in the city of New York. Or think about the Black Freedom Movement. Think about the role of the FBI in spying on Martin Luther King. Or think about the role of the FBI and local police departments in spying on the Black Panthers and in actually confusing and diverting their capacity to plan their own politics, to plan a politics of protest in the interest of the Black Freedom Movement. Instead, we got, toward the close of that movement, we got all sorts of mayhem as well as murder as a result of the interference of our national security agencies with the course of the Black Freedom Movement. Well, what about now? Now, the security agencies and their capacities are bigger, better, they have the internet. We know all that from the exposés of Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden. That's true. Although I still have the big question about their sort of intellectual capacity to use the information that they are gathering. But leave that to one side. It's not my point. My point is different. That, you know, I think we are at a movement moment, which is why I suggested my original title in the United States. We know that not only from Occupy and the resonance it had in American politics, but we know it also from the scattered insurgencies that are breaking out all over among low-wage workers, among teachers, among students, among homeowners who are foreclosed. So maybe this is a movement moment. You can never tell when you're in the middle of it. You have to sort of step back and see the overall arch of the movement, and that you don't have the benefit of that excepting by hindsight. But if we are, then our attitude towards surveillance becomes even more important than it ordinarily is. I think that surveillance, infiltration, has been going on for a long time. Maybe it's bigger and better now. But I also think it is inevitable. There is no way we're going to stop the authorities from trying to spy on those who are opposed to the authorities, those who are planning to make trouble, those who want to make social change. Or, you know, maybe the ACLU can rein them in a little bit. Maybe the Center for Constitutional Rights can take some cases, but they're going to keep trying to do this. inevitable, because they see themselves as, in a sense, besieged by the troublemakers. So they're going to do it. And let's let the good lawyers try to rein them in. And what we should, I think, work on is first trying to do our political work in spite of surveillance and infiltration. And two, we should be very wary of ourselves being responsible for exaggerating their awesome, omniscient powers. And I think we tend to do that a lot. I don't think the old, fabled Mayor Daley of Chicago ever could tell every misstep of every saloon keeper in Chicago, but I swear every saloon keeper really thought they had to toe the line and work for Daley or they would lose their license. Or, you know, think about the universities where we work. I see wonderful graduate students, buoyant, energetic, warm, hopeful, turn into scared assistant professors. That is not good. It's not good for them. It's not good for this institution. It's not good for students. And the reason is that they vastly exaggerate the extent to which they have to toe the intellectual and the political line in order to get reappointed and in order to get tenure. When we do that, when we exaggerate surveillance, infiltration, sabotage, and punishment, we are making them more powerful. We have to remember instead that the reason that they're engaging in surveillance, penetration, intimidation, and sabotage, because they're also afraid of us. Thank you.
Okay, Chuck.
Oh.
So does everybody come and sit down if they've got a chair here?
Sorry.
Another chair here. Okay, Chuck.
Okay. Well, I certainly want to thank the organizers, Dave, and the other organizers of this symposium. It's quite a remarkable event, and to have all the seats filled is very encouraging. What? Mike. Is it not? I don't think it's on.
Caress your mic.
Is it on?
No, I don't. Oh, shit. How's that? Yes, I can hear my voice. Yeah, I just was thanking the organizers of this symposium. I think it is hopefully a movement moment, but it certainly is a time to reflect about what's happening in this country politically. I want to begin with a text. There was a story about 10 days ago in the New York Times about Oakland, California, and in Oakland they noted that the government through Department of Homeland Security had given $7 million to the Oakland police force for their counterterrorism efforts. Now, at present, there really are not a lot of terrorists walking on the streets of Oakland. So Oakland, as typical of police forces all over the country, the 30,000 or so different municipalities, took that $7 million and have used it to increase their surveillance of keeping track of license plates in the barrio and poor communities, and to put more cameras up around the city. And this, I think, is a immediate example I want to return to that example at the end, but I just want to mention that as what I think is very typical of what's happening with the vast resources that have been mobilized in this country in the name of counterterrorism. Now, I think it's worth asking what the context is for that, and I think it's fairly obvious. It's 9/11, which has seared itself into the experience of everyone in New York, maybe many of you in this room. Certainly, institutionally, John Jay has a unique relationship to it with all our alumni who died, some of whom were taking my courses on terrorism in the 1990s. So and I did a book on it. I followed, talked to survivors, and so I've been keenly aware on almost a daily basis of the power of 9/11, both in terms of personal experience and suffering, but also how it changed us politically. And it's not as though, it's not as though there was not some collective paranoia in this country on the margins, and it's not as though there wasn't terrorism, and it's not as though all the things that came together after 9/11 were non-existent. It's that they all converged and fed on each other in a kind of a synergistic way and moved from the margins more into the mainstream. So that fear, and of course we fought 2 wars. I mean, sometimes it's hard to remember. I mean, it's easy to forget that more than the past decade, for over a decade, we were a country at war, fighting two wars in the Middle East, and we're still at war, right? Which also touched me personally. One of my sons was in Iraq, so I've often wonder, why do people like me have children who fight the wars that they disagree with? But that has always made my personal relationship to the war and my feelings of disgust really with particularly Iraq, why we went in, particularly intense. But the rising fear and collective fear and paranoia was part of building up in new ways. I mean, I think what Francis was talking about is very important. These things have long historical backgrounds. Surveillance didn't start yesterday, but it became newly significant, and it connected with a couple of very important things. One is the whole approach, the way in which the infrastructure got built up is important to understand. That the FBI has a definition of terrorism, which political violence against civilians, et cetera, but it's violence committed against people, and then they have a parenthetical phrase, comma, or property. So that, and the FBI definitions matter. The FBI definition of terrorism is the basis for the counterterrorism structures that have developed at the national level, but also at the local level in every police force and every joint terrorism task force, which is where the police, and there's none that is more developed and more sophisticated than in New York, where the police and the FBI work together at the local level. And they're all governed by that. So that PETA, Earth First, these activities, these movements, these organizations that are really critical for any kind of coherent dissent in this country, come under the rubric of terrorism. So that if you get into a demonstration and you throw a brick through a McDonald's window, which is, of course, what we all should be doing on a regular basis, you are subject to the structures, not just the police structures. You haven't just committed a misdemeanor, but you're under the auspices potentially of the counterterrorism. Now, that I mean, the NYPD, there were, in the 1990s, there were maybe 10 or 15 people in the NYPD who dealt with terrorism. There were a handful of FBI people who were working in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I know because they were taking my courses in the 1990s. After 9/11, the Counterterrorism Bureau swelled to over 1,000 officers. They have 1,000 people working, and they have two units. They have the Intel unit and the Counterterrorism Bureau. And as you probably have read in the paper in the last year or so, it's been occasionally mentioned. They were videotaping since 9/11. They were videotaping every single mosque in New York and every single person who came in and out of those mosques, and then following and keeping tabs on them. Every single person who either was a Muslim going into prison in New York or coming out of prison, who might have converted in prison, had a file and was followed regularly. This is not paranoid. It's the way. Is there any more water in that? Since I poured the water all over the table. Thanks. I'll try to control myself. That's right. That's hard to do. So in this sort of fear, there's these real structures which blended or connect with this widespread fear and paranoia, and has led to a really seriously exaggerated sense of the dangers we face with terrorism. And surveillance is a really critical part of that. A friend of mine, Martin Miller, just came out with a book actually last month. I had him here at John Jay. And very interesting historian from Duke about state violence versus sort of traditional terrorism, which is usually defined as a subnational group, political company aimed at committing political violence aimed at civilians, a couple of other criteria, but that is usually separate from state violence. And Martin argues that if you look at the 20th century, if you look at the last 100 years, there have been basically, he counts, and you could dispute the actual count, but it's certainly in the range of what would be accurate. He counts 179 million people have been killed as a result of state violence. Wars, violence, all kinds of strife. If you try to count up, doing this with my graduate students a couple of weeks ago, how many people have been killed in the 20th century, the last 100 years with terrorism? Really, it's probably in the range of 20, 25,000. If you throw in Sri Lanka and Turkey against the Kurds, which were really civil wars, but labeled terrorism, you might increase that number to 70 or 75,000. So somewhere between 25,000 and 75,000 people have died as a result of terrorism. And 179 million people in that range have died from state violence. So, we've lost perspective on what the problem is and what we're dealing with because of the exaggerated, somewhat understandable, but exaggerated response to 9/11. Now, of course, the Snowden material is very much in that context. I gather from talking to my sort of human rights friends, and I was actually at some meetings a couple of weeks ago with Daniel Ellsberg, who's a friend of mine, and several leading human rights people, and they had an interesting observation on the Snowden material, and their reaction was most of what has been revealed is really not that either surprising or upsetting, or it's a lot of diplomatic gossip. Now, some people got very upset, the president of Brazil, because they were spying on the president of Brazil and picking up her phone messages, was very annoyed and canceled a meeting with Obama. Cameron, the prime minister of Britain, you would think that the state secrets that compromise the national security of Britain is at stake, and France is just paper today, France has gotten upset. So all of and the Obama administration, this sort of exaggerated response that, terrible national security is, we really need to fear the consequence of these revelations. It would seem that for the most part, the what has been revealed is not that significant. What matters is that they bothered to gather all this information, that they have it. Now, maybe they're too stupid to know what to do with it, which is a good observation. But there could well be some smart people come along who could figure out what to do with it. And the fact that they're committed to gathering this mountain of data. And of course, increasingly, they're better able to find ways through various programs to mine the big data. And you focus on the NSA and the CIA, these sort of national organizations. Don't forget Oakland. Oakland, which takes its money for counterterrorism, and what they do, they're gathering big data on people, the license plates, and the people in the barrio, the poor people, and then they're processing that big data in order to make more arrests of people dealing drugs in Oakland, having nothing to do with terrorism. That's the use that they're putting it to. So I think it's fair to say the problem is we don't have enough terrorists to justify all of these structures. You could say maybe there will be terrorists. We don't have enough. So when you have somebody like Faisal Shahzad, Times Square tried to blow up the car, didn't happen. It becomes a monumental event. If you can finally have somebody who might be talking about doing something bad on the phone that you can gather, you can figure out by surveillance, you have 10 people watching that person, tapping their phone, following them, and trying to keep track of them, and that it makes for having built up these structures and having gathered all this data, the inadequacy of the number of people whom we need to worry about is really there just aren't enough. So there has to be manufactured. You have to make it up, and that's why it's so important. I think that the FBI definition is sort of toxic. Definition, by the way, which precedes 9/11. It's been around for some time. It just didn't have much political significance the way the FBI understood terrorism, because terrorism really wasn't much of a problem until 9/11. The problem, however, may be generated, and I want to go back to Oakland. So they take this money from the Department of Homeland Security. They increase their surveillance of the poor people and the people in the barrio, mostly with drugs. Where do they send them? They send them to prisons, New Folsom mainly, in California, which is a metaphor. It is a real place. It is unbelievably awful. But it's also a metaphor for a global process of incarceration. It is the worst of the worst, New Folsom Prison. It is under court order. They don't know what to do with it. They keep sending more and more people there. Mark Ham who was also at John Jay this fall in my center, he's just written this book. He's been following it for 25 years, even long before 9/11, and certainly much more intensely since then. He was a warden and then went into academia. And New Folsom, which nobody really knows about, nobody really understands, because we don't get into prisons. Who knows what really happens in prisons? They have 50% of the inmates in New Folsom either have active HIV or hepatitis C. 50%. They do nothing all day. They have triple bunks. He was showing pictures in New Folsom because it's so incredibly overcrowded. Everybody is divided by gangs. They just lie around all day long. They work out and they fight and they kill one another, and then you have SWAT teams that come in and try to break them up, and they go their merry way. They're also in the edges, and one doesn't know whether it's in the edges or more in the mainstream, is a good deal of political activity that's going on. 1 million people have converted in prison to Islam since 9/11. Now, what does that mean? For most people, it's a wonderful, uplifting, personally significant experience. It may also be connected to a kind of despair and political action that could lead easily to violence. So you have the misuse of funds to try to save Oakland from terrorism, only to increase the horrors of this prison system, which, if there's any place in this country that could be a breeding ground for people, a breeding ground for terrorism, for people doing, potentially doing bad things, it's in the despair and the suffering that goes on in places like New Folsom. Nothing could be more irrational. Nothing could be truly crazier, and such a colossal waste of life and potential being thrown down the drain. Thank you.
Okay, so we have, whatever we have, plenty of time, 15, 20 minutes for discussion, questions, commentary to Fran or Chuck about anything. Yep.
Questions for Dr. Strozier. You were talking about how politics inherently place labels on groups, these terrorist labels on groups that aren't terrorists in themselves. But wouldn't you say that there are groups like the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front that, while they may not be terrorists, their behavior is?
Not really. I mean, sure, there are groups. Some of the environmental groups have, anarchist elements. They have more radical fringes where people do play with violence. That happens. I think any movement, if we're going to have a movement, that you have to allow. There's energy and excitement, and you have people drawn to it where the movement is not trying to commit violence, but you might have some people at the edges of it who would be drawn to hurting people. But most of these, the environmental cause is really the crisis that we face in terms of our place in the world and our survival and our own future. And it's only going to get worse. I mean, Sandy is a warning. I'm actually doing some work on climate change and political violence, and looking at a place like Syria, for example, which suffered a terrible drought from 2006 to 2011. And there were a couple of million people, internal migration. They were forced to the cities. A place like Aleppo went from 4,000 people to 400,000. There was, and they were pushed then, and particularly in the Northwest where they have a little oil. The Assad administration gave the land to his cronies, which further destabilized the country, and that's all the background to then the war and destruction. So we're a little in the United States because we've had Sandy, but we haven't really encountered the full thrust of climate change. But we will. We will. And that will, I think, touch people's imagination, and particularly young people. What is their future? What is their land? What kind of hope can they have in the world? You guys. And it's likely to generate a very significant social movement that will build over time, because the crisis is so severe and so total that we don't really fully understand it, but it will impact our lives. And there will be very strong reactions against it. And I think what we see now in some of the environmental movements is a harbinger of the kind of political action that will be coming. And that's important dissent. That matters. It is crucial that those groups are able to maintain the energy and the excitement and make people think about what it means to build another damn McDonald's or build another shopping center, and maybe to blow up the shopping center. I mean, but not to kill people. If you kill people, then you've moved into another realm. But given where we are right now, if you destroy a piece of property, you're in the same category as, you know, a jihadist coming from Yemen who might want to put a bomb in the subway. And that really worries me, terrifies me in terms of future political action and building the kind of movement that Francis talked about.
I want to comment on your comments.
We'll have to pass.
I agree with your fundamental distinction, a moral distinction, but also a strategic distinction between violence against people and violence against property. Nevertheless, violence against property is not a moral sin. Violence against people is a moral sin. Nevertheless, I think violence against property can often be a strategic error. And that is because the way the public or our audience interprets what we're doing, its morality, what it means for a community considered in the abstract, is very much influenced by the pundits, the authorities, by the propaganda machine. And when a movement engages in violence against property, it's relatively easy to tar them with the brush of undisciplined violence. But that's a strategic argument. And I think there are strategic circumstances in which violence against property can more easily be justified to the audience or the public that observes the movement.
Wouldn't you say, I would reserve the word violence for violence against people, maybe destruction of property, which I don't embrace. I mean, I think I would agree, there's nothing to be gained, really, but people will throw bricks through McDonald's windows, and to destroy property, the morality should be reserved for when violence is directed against people and where people suffer and are hurt.
Well, I think morally I would condemn violence against people, although there may even be strategic justifications for violence against people. I mean, if those other people are menacing your constituency, there may come circumstances where violence against people cannot be avoided. But what I'm saying is that violence in the public, or our various diverse publics, I think they tend to shun, they almost innately, there's a shunning of violence. A violence that brings uncertainty, it brings destruction. And if the authorities and the propagandists can successfully pin the label of violence on your group, you're in a certain amount of trouble, I think, in building your own constituency. It's a strategic question. Do the circumstances permit you to justify to the public your violence? You burned down that fence because the fence was obstructing access to your own land or something like that. Are you in a situation where you can justify that? It's a strategic question. And I think movements succeed or fail in significant measure based on their strategic choices.
Karen?
Yeah, I do want to speak very strongly for nonviolence as the most effective tactic, both with a surveillance state. They can listen to anything I say, and they have been for years, and it is totally based upon nonviolent action. I think it's much more effective to put a picket line around McDonald's and keep people from eating the poison that is being sold, and to support the low-wage workers inside McDonald's than ever to throw a brick through a window, which is just stupid and counterproductive, and don't do it. Don't do it. You must be nonviolent, because then you can be open, you can be brave, you can be committed, and you are morally correct and strategically correct. So please, 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 it's very important. It's going to become more important. The commitment to nonviolence has to be absolute, absolute.
Yeah.
Sarah had raised Susan Uptoe had raised the question of Greenpeace, which was nonviolent. I mean, that's a nonviolent demonstration, and Russia went crazy. I mean, Putin's out of his mind. And then you have the folks, the indigenous folks in Canada who are opposing fracking. You know, they're nonviolent. And those nonviolent protests are just building. The movement against fracking all over the world in 24 countries now, 24 states. So I think that there really is a nonviolent movement happening. And I think, I don't know why there isn't much more activity to get the Greenpeace sailors out of Russian prison. It seems to me there should be a great big global movement beyond boycotting the opera.
Yeah, I think one of the, I found the other mic, so I would wholeheartedly embrace and endorse the idea of commitment to nonviolence. I think in the long run it is far and away the most effective way to sustain a movement and sustain dissent, and win in the end, you know, and also make your enemy a better person. I mean, that was always an important goal in Satyagraha for Gandhi, not only to create a movement that could address real injustice, but in the process to remove the injustice, but to elevate morally the sensibilities of your opponent. And that's one reason why the campaigns that he waged were so effective. My only point is that, the basic point is that the structures are in place now that have the potential to in a very frightening way, to stifle dissent, legitimate dissent, as it might get mobilized.
I just want to enter a proviso again. I mean, if you have to have a one-word, or I guess a two-word slogan to describe the stance of the movement, I'll pick nonviolence. But it can be strategically complicated. For example, the civil rights movement, widely applauded for its nonviolence, had as its defenders in Mississippi the Deacons for Defense from Holmes County, Mississippi, who were armed defenders of the right of civil rights protesters to engage in nonviolent protest. Or we have a whole history of labor strife in which the picket line is very, very important. Not the contemporary picket line, which is a creation of the courts and the judges, but the actual picket line emerged as the physical threat of striking workers to beat the shit out of anybody who scamped on them. So, I'm sorry that we can't have an absolutely simple black and white answer to this question, but the world and the strategic dilemmas that we confront makes it a little bit complicated. So you have to consider the many factors that go into a movement's choices.
Well, we need to embrace radicalization. You know, radicalization has been in the counterterrorism world has become the synonym for becoming a terrorist. And all of us on this panel and over there against the wall are old. It come from a day when, you know, it was good to be radical, and now it's evil to be radical. And that one of the things that the kind of to be assertive and pain in the ass, and to question authority, and to claim the right to speak up in a society which is where speaking up hasn't really occurred much, is something that is crucial for undoing some of this tamping down some of the fear, the paranoia, the irrationality, and maybe undoing some of these structures. We need to understand what's going on in a place like Oakland, so that, and the real connection between a place like what's happening in Oakland and New Folsom, so that we can move toward much more creative and healthy and hopeful things in our society.
Barry.
Yeah, I just want to say, in terms of the Russian point of view, hopefully the last session we'll have a Russian professor who's here, John Jay, to give you the view of, from the Russian people. I don't know if Russia's come up at all before in this session, but stick around.
Putin idiot.
Yeah. Other than that, right?
Other than that, we've said nothing about Russia.
So Olga will be here, hopefully, to give you the Russian point of view.
Tammy.
I think there's the discussion of violence and the kind of passionate statement towards nonviolent action and nonviolent protest is complicated. And a case in point, in Mexico in 2006, there was a teachers' strike. And when teachers strike, they don't go home at night. They sleep where the strike is. And after days of the strike, the governor had helicopters drop tear gas and smoke and pepper spray onto the 50,000 striking teachers, and then proceeded to arrest many of them in violent arrests. So there became a popular movement that became everybody except the middle class, the upper classes were involved in this. And there were thugs that were then sent into the communities. So community people and teachers took the buses and surrounded their communities with buses, and that's property. And that's either city-owned or state-owned property. And they set the buses on fire. That was about, that's definitely, in a way, crossing over from nonviolence, but it is a way of using the state apparatus and using private property, but to protect your own people. And so I think that we have to be careful when we talk about absolutes, and that we have to recognize that some of our own struggles here in New York might be very different than people in other countries. And that we can't, we've got to be delicate on how we approach that analysis.
Okay, good. Someone over there. Yep, Candace.
My question's for Chuck, or anybody. Megadata. I can see the argument about Oakland. It is exceptionally powerful. And we all have to think about it really deeply as to what has happened in this country in the name of anti-terrorism. Having said that, I'm very focused on what's going on with the NSA revelations, and after all, this is about Snowden here. And I am asking whether you think there has been a major shift, a turn, for my literary friends, a turn away from anti-terrorism as the underlying symbolic reason for this to something else. And the reason I ask that, I mean, today, just read the paper today, you alluded to this, David, about the president of France, the president of Brazil have been spied upon, and these countries are a tad annoyed, and to come back and say, well, but it's all in the name of anti-terrorism, that's why we're spying on the presidents of other countries, is you got to do better than that. And so I'm wondering, in order to continue this massive mega data collection and the fusion centers and the attempting of connecting at the dots and the leaking to corporate interests that can sell the data, it's not going to be anti-terrorism anymore. It's something else. How can it be justified?
Well, I think it can be justified.
But you know what I mean.
Right, but the larger explanation, there's good reason to believe, and this is sort of not quite anecdotal, but people who've looked at it pretty closely, that the gathering of big data has assumed a kind of life of its own. And that the Obama administration has gathered twice as much as the Bush administration, and the Bush administration gathered twice as much as the Clinton administration. Now, whether it's twice or the point is, there's a kind of there's a momentum at the state level toward this activity. And it serves all kinds of purposes. It justifies their budgets. It justifies what they do. There are technical problems. If you gather the telephones, the telephone conversations of people in the Middle East, they're calling sometimes to New York, and so you pick up. Why you have to get why you would. There's also a lot of ways in which one can move the system and make change. And I mean, for example, as I was saying, I think it's very important to. And many John Jay students can have a special relationship to the criminal justice system in all of its forms. And I think to have awareness, to be sensitive to what kinds of things need to happen, can contribute mightily to something, to social change. So that we don't all have to be on the barricades. I mean, I think we should make sure that those scared assistant professors are on the barricades. People do different things. Right now, we've come out of such a long period of time without activism, and we've allowed, as those of us who have some concern, as a people, we've allowed activism to be labeled as somehow bad, dangerous, and even potentially disruptive, and to be suppressed. And we've sort of been sleeping. While you were sleeping, suddenly the government has created this monster that it still is our government. We still have the power to affect change so that we don't get squashed by this gargantuan machine.
Yeah, go on. Then I'll make a comment and then we'll change it. Go on.
Although I really, really do appreciate the positive spirit in terms of the value of social activism, both in terms of what it accomplishes in society and also the way it brings a sense of meaning and connection to others. The woman, I'm sorry I'm late, who I imagine has coordinated this, Francis, who said, I challenge you to question when psychologically activism has really been suppressed. Although I don't think Occupy Wall Street has failed, I think there are continuing effects from it. Nevertheless, the profiling of people that were consistently involved in Occupy Wall Street, the ridiculous multiple arrests for people who made no violations but to try to speak their opinion, it seems to me that they did at least shut that down. The PSYOPs approach to environmentalists, particularly scientists, that are speaking against things like hydraulic fracturing and the natural gas pipeline that Keystone wants to put through. Some of these scientists tried to go and speak, and I don't know if it was the Senate or the Congress, and one woman, all she wanted to do was speak, which I think you're allowed to do as an American. They arrested her and put her in jail and labeled her as an eco-terrorist. That seems to me relatively insane. And now we got Cuomo pushing through hydraulic fracturing, and I think that's partly because nobody's paying attention to the science, because the politicians and the money people are running the show. So has it died down? No, this country is gasland is spreading all over the world, but I would say suppression is having some impact.
Yeah, I think it always has some impact. I think that movements and their ability to sustain themselves and their ability to refuel and rise up again is a result of the concatenation of the energies and hopes that come from the bottom and the various stratagems for repression and co-optation that come from the top. And that's why they're so irregular in their form and in their shape. It's why it sort of seems to break out all over. But they're powerful problems in the society that are fueling those movements. Problems of broken promises for young people, problems of inequality, problems of, I mean, think of what 10 million homeowners underwater. Those are, this is really what you were talking about. You're talking about trying to make a good life, trying to have stability, trying to earn a living. Why shouldn't people have a little house if that's sort of the image of the good life of their culture? That's what people tried to do, and they worked hard, and they paid the mortgage, and then essentially the financial industry stole that house from them. Millions of them. So there are protest movements building up in the United States today, and I think they will grow as they've grown elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
Today, I think maybe right now, there's a demonstration at City College because the president of City College, with support from the chancellor, has decided to take over the Shakur Morales Center, which is a community-based center where a lot of the activities of the students take place. Yesterday there was around 800 students demonstrating, and today there's another demonstration. So I think that it happens, and that it's just that it's hard to see it because the media doesn't really talk about it happening. But today there could be 1,000 students out on a picket line, really demanding that their community center at the City College of New York is in place, and they can't take it over for another administration office.
I don't doubt it,
Yeah.
and I respect the people that participate. I wish I can, but I cannot tell my professor, I'm sorry, I missed class because I was protesting.
You could if I were your professor.
Yeah, right.
You could if I
Take the
were.
portion from the people in this room, right?
You have to choose your professor. Okay, we're going to go on to the next thing. I just want to just say one thing. You know, Fran is, you know, a long-time student of social movements, and so am I. And I participated in many social movements before, you know, I went into university. I used to be a shop steward in a factory, and then I was a labour leader for youth, and you know, and I was blacklisted when I was 9. Sounded my first strike when I was 19 years old, and that's when I was put first point on the blacklist in London. And you know, I never thought, you know, it never dawned on me to stop. You know, I didn't. You know, one of the reasons is, you know, because I kind of learned early on that this wasn't the world I wanted to live in. I wanted a different world. You know, I didn't want a world of oppression. I didn't want a world of marginalisation. I didn't want to be a world of being told what to do all the time. But I needed to make that world. And, you know, it wasn't that I was, you know, necessarily revolutionary. You know, I mean, I did become a revolutionary. But at that point, it was just about, I'm not going to put up, you know, with this crap. And so I first started organising young people, 16 years of age and 17, who were in a sweatshop, and fired, and they were totally abused, and wages stolen from them, and they had absolutely, the kids, no sense of their own empowerment, none. I mean, virtually none. They were very beaten down, they were very fatalistic, and we used to sign up in the union in the toilet, because you couldn't sign up openly. And in about, I don't know, a month or so, I'd sign up 50, 60 people, you know, in the union, and this was the first time I'd ever been a member of any kind of voluntary organisation. And after about 2 or 3 months of organising in that way, I remember coming in one day, and I'm just 19 years of age, and the foreman came over to me and he said, don't touch, I was working on a lathe, he said, don't touch that lathe. And I said, why? I kind of knew what was going to happen. He said, you've got to see the floor manager, he wants to see you. And they marched me over, 2 guys, either side of me, marched me over to the floor manager, and I said, what's up? And he says, and he threw my card. In England, when you fire somebody, they give you your cards, their insurance cards, and he threw the cards at me across the table, and he said, take these and get out, he said, you're fired. And I didn't have any protection. So I was very angry and I was very militant. And at the time, and I I literally picked the cards up and I threw them back in his face, and I told him to stick it where the sun doesn't shine. And this wasn't going to be the end of the story. And then these guards came in and they marched me out of the factory. And I get outside the factory gate and they closed the gates behind me, and I thought, you know, what the fuck am I going to do now? I mean, I'm outside, they're inside, I'm 19, what do I know? So in those days, you didn't have cell phones, and I ran to a phone which was about a mile away, and I called up. I had a union card, and there was one, you know, an organizer on the card, and I called his number, and it was an office number. And I said, you know, this is Dave Brother, I'm shop steward, who's been elected. He said, oh, you're Dave Brother, and you're the one who's been signing up all those young members down at that factory. That factory's never had a union, and it's been there, you know, X amount of years. And I said, yeah. I said, but what am I going to do? They just fired me. He said, can you get a walkout? And I said, of course I can. And I thought, how the fuck am I going to do that? I'm going to get a walkout. So I go back to the factory. I have no idea I'm going to do this. And I found a gate at the back of the factory, and it was open. And I walked in, it was where they deliver all the goods. This place made all these kind of metal machines. And I walked into the delivery yard, and the guys are standing here, and they're saying, Dave, what happened to you? And I said, I got fired. And they said, well, what are we going to do? I said, we're going to walk out. And they said, yes! We're going to walk out. And so I had these two guys and me. Neither of these guys have ever taken any industrial action in their life. And we just walked into the factory, and we went up to and the guys were all looking at me, and there's kind of a, you know, they're all, you know, eyes focused. And I said, we're out on strike. I had no idea what I was doing. And we just walked up and down the line, and at the end of the line, and then the manager was over there, and he locked his door like that. And all the kids are smashing on the door and sticking their fingers up, middle fingers, you know, because now all that resentment and anger. So anyway, we came out, and 120 kids came out on strike out of about 300 people. And we struck for 9 days. And we won after 9 days. We closed the whole factory down. And they branded me in the newspaper as the blonde anarchist. And I didn't even know what anarchism meant. And we won the strike, and, you know, boom, boom, boom. And then I went off, after a couple of months, I went off and organised in a big factory with a union, the Ford factory. But the interesting thing is, we won that strike, right, with all these kids that have never struck in their world. Many of them left school, obviously, without any O-levels, anything, any certificates whatsoever. And about 3 years later, I finished this here, we're back into that town, and I'm walking down the street, and his car pulls up, and this guy says, you remember me, David? It was this guy who was kind of a senior worker. And I said, yes. He said, oh, he said, you should see that factory now. I said, what? He said, oh, we've got 3.5 weeks holiday. We've got, our hours have been cut to 38 from 40. We've got 5 shop stewards that have paid time off. You'd never recognise the place. 10 minutes.